Well, good afternoon, everybody. It looks like a fabulous turnout for today's lecture. My name is Barb Thomas, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Renewable Resources, and I warmly welcome you here all to our 78th FILS lecture and our 40th year of presenting this series. So it's quite impressive. Before we begin the program today, I'd like to state that the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I would now like to invite you all to take a look at the lecture program handbook that you were given at the front. It provides a nice brief history on the back of FILS that's being provided by Dr. Peter Murphy. I had Bolinas in my head suddenly. Dr. Peter Murphy. And very much appreciate him putting the time into putting that together for us. The other thing that I'd like you to notice that's in the pamphlet is, of course, our sponsors. We have 35 wonderful sponsors who support this series. And I would like to put that up on the screen, which was working earlier. And to quickly run through our list of sponsors, we have Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, Alberta Forest Products Association, Alberta Innovates, ANC Timber Inc., Alberta Pacific Forest Industries Inc., Altus Geomatics, the Association of Alberta Forest Management Professionals, CanFor, the Canadian Institute of Forestry, Rocky Mountain Section, Connie Dermott Environment and Forestry Service, DLA Piper LLP, Earth Econ Inc., Four Core Solutions Inc., Forest Soil Science Limited, FP Innovations, FRI Research, Forest Economic Advisors, FEA, FY Forest Limited, Genome Alberta, a new sponsor, Greenlink Forestry Inc., Horseshoe Creek Consulting H2O Limited, Incremental Forest Technologies Limited, Miller Western Forest Products Limited, MNP LLP, Natural Resources Canada, Division of Canadian Forest Service, our Northern Forestry Centre here in Edmonton, Norboard Inc., Philippe Robert Enterprises Limited, PwC Canada, Silvacom Limited, Toco Industries Limited, Vanderwell Contractors 1971 Limited, West Fraser Mills and all of their divisions, Weyerhaeuser Edmonton, Wild and Pine, which is a new name, which was NICAL, Woodland Operations Learning Foundation. So I'd like you to all join me in thanking all these many, many sponsors in support of our series. I would now like to introduce Dr. Ellen McDonald. She is the chair of our Department of Renewable Resources, and she has a few words of greeting from the department and faculty. Ellen.
Thanks, Barb, and thank you to all of you for coming. It's fabulous to see such a wonderful turnout for this 78th lecture in our 40th year. Really exciting to see how far this has come since it began. I'm bringing greetings on behalf of the department, but also on behalf of our Dean, Stan Blade, a Faculty of Agricultural Life and Environmental Sciences. He wasn't able to be with us here today. I'm just going to share a few little exciting things that are happening or have happened since the spring FILS in the department and in the faculty. Our undergraduate enrollments are up again, so the undergraduate forestry programs are up to 84 now, which is really exciting. And we have 372 students, undergraduate students in the Environment and Conservation Sciences program, so we're quite busy with teaching. About 70% of those are in the land rec and conservation biology majors that our department is primarily responsible for teaching. In our department, we have 190 graduate students, and of these, 19 are registered in our professional course-based Masters of Forestry program, so that's exciting to see a number of students interested in developing a career in forestry. We had a couple of big reviews in the last year. First, we had an external review of our entire faculty, so that was our undergraduate, graduate, and research programs. This is part of a review process that's mandated by the provincial government, and we were one of the first round of faculties at the U of A to go through the review in this latest round, and I'd say we came through with flying colors. We got really positive comments from the review in terms of all three of those areas, and some suggestions, of course, and we're taking those into consideration as we move forward with planning for the coming years. We also had a review of our forestry programs by the Canadian Forestry Accreditation Board, which is happens every 6 years, and I'm pleased to say we got an outstanding review on that, and our programs have been accredited for another 6 years into the future. We've been busy with turnover of academic staff. We had a number of important retirements. John Spence retired in spring, and both our silviculture professors, Phil Como and Vic Leifers, are partially retired now. So we're working to fill those gaps. We've recruited 2 new faculty who will be starting in January, and we're working on a 3rd one now. So we've been quite busy with that. Many exciting research projects in our department, so I encourage you to check out our website, look at our latest copy of Renew magazine, which you can access through our website and find out things that we've been doing. Also, you can join our department seminar series. We now have an option for anyone to join our department seminar series from a remote location, and if you're interested in that, contact me or Christy Nohos, or if you get the seminar notices, it will have a link and show you how you can do that. So we hope to work to connect even further with our communities by opening up the barrier. You don't have to come here to hear what's happening anymore. You can sit at your computer wherever you happen to be and join us. So lots of exciting things, and we really value the partnerships with our external communities and hope to continue to build those as we move ahead into the future. So thanks for your attention, and I'm going to ask Aldous Sillins to come up and introduce our speaker for today. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. It's my well, first of all, I want to welcome you to our 78th Forest Industry Lecture Series. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Monica Emelko, who is going to be our speaker for the day. Monica is we've had a very diverse seminar series over the years. We've had lots of different kinds of speakers that have provided insights into sort of pressing issues that we're all concerned about. This one is going to be a little bit different in the sense of Dr. Monica Emelko is a drinking water treatment engineer, and many of you probably haven't had the opportunity to hear a drinking water treatment engineer talk about pressing land management issues. So this is going to be quite a different one. Monica is a treatment engineer from University of Waterloo, from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, where among many other roles she plays, she leads the water quality technology and policy group there. She has a long and sort of growing list of high impact publications. But in particular, there's a couple of things that stand out. She co-leads a group that was really was the first group recognized by IPCC in identifying water quality associated threats to drinking water and drinking water security. And she now co-leads a very new for-water Canada-wide internationally partnered NSERC network focused on forest management-based approaches to drinking water source protection. So I talked about her expertise. She, not just in scientific realm, she's actually in a fair bit of demand nationally and internationally when it comes to government agencies that are tasked with with drinking water and drinking water security. She served as technical expert advisor reviewer on numerous regulatory panels focused on potable drinking water, on pathogen regulations, surface water, groundwater, and drinking water standards, both here and in the US. And by here, I mean Canadian, but she's also sat on those same kind of panels just right here in Alberta. So she has interesting connections internationally, nationally, and provincially. She currently serves on the US National Academy of Sciences Water Technology Expert Committee. Many of you have heard of the Catskills and the issues around source water protection there. So she serves on a expert committee that's basically looking at New York's operational support framework for their water supply and water supply response to climate change and shifting climates in the future. So I was particularly pleased that Dr. Emelko was selected as our 78th FILS speaker. She brings an extraordinarily unique and diverse perspective that you probably haven't heard that's gonna bring together two sort of disparate worlds historically that don't interact. So the drinking water treatment engineering world, and then the land management world that most of you are very comfortable with. So I'm really anticipating that this is going to be an interesting and hopefully challenging lecture that we receive from Dr. Emelko. So a lot of what she's going to be talking about is going to underpin some of the particularly challenging and complex issues around integrated source water protection that we're very familiar with as an emerging issue in Alberta. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Monica Emelko to the stage for her lecture entitled Strategic Importance of Canada's Forests in National Drinking Water Security.
Thanks, Elvis. All right. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so very much for that introduction, Aldous. It is such a pleasure to be back in Alberta and to be here with you today. I have attended Phil's lectures in the past, and I have seen them on video, and I'm just really, really honored and humbled to be in that group. I'm very appreciative to the sponsors who have afforded me the opportunity to come and be here, and I've already had some really great discussions with folks, and I'm looking forward to another day of that tomorrow. I'm very thankful to the Department of Renewable Resources and all of the AILS faculty for putting on this event. It's so wonderful to have an opportunity to speak with colleagues who are dealing with similar issues. And so I appreciate your introduction, Aldous, and I'll try to live up to it. What I'll say is that I am a drinking water treatment engineer and not a land manager. I wasn't trained that way at all. My background is in chemical engineering and environmental engineering from the United States. And I was very, very happy to have the opportunity to move to Canada. And a big part of that is because there's a tremendous history, especially in the city of Calgary, with not only Canadian leadership, but global leadership in the drinking water treatment industry. And there's also a great history of partnership between all relevant parties in the water industry. So not only the government at all levels, but consulting industries, academia, and really working together between those arenas to do what's right in situations where there aren't always easy answers. So my talk is very much about forests, but it's through a lens of a drinking water treatment engineer and the issue of the strategic importance of Canada's forests and national drinking water security. So it's a little bit of my story, and there's a little bit of growth associated with my story because you learn through life and you're continuously learning. So I'm just gonna unmute that. Okay. And this was working previously, but that's okay. I can work without it. So perhaps it's not surprising why I'm here, although it is surprising that the computer won't advance. Let's see what I can do. see if I can beat Angus before he gets down here to save me. What do you think, Angus? Not feeling like I'm... Oh, okay. Hang on a second. Let me try this. Is that working? Let's see. Okay, yay, I beat you. All right. I so thought that wasn't going to happen. Okay, so forests. I suspect everybody in this room, and most people much better than me here, know about the importance or the relationship between forests and water. Forests are without a doubt critical sources of drinking water globally. Take your pick of parts of the world, and in different ways, forests play a key role in the world's drinking water supplies. 60% of the world's biggest cities, 60% of the water supplies for the world's 100 largest cities get their water from forested areas. 2/3 of all the water supplies in the United States, including 40% of municipalities and 180 million people, get their water from forested areas. They might not live in the middle of the forest. The water may make its way downstream, but that's where their water comes from. And indeed, in Canada, that's also true. Here in Alberta, 2/3 of Albertans get their water from the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So certainly, forests do play a role, and they play a role in drinking water security. And I'd like to say that drinking water security, the way a treatment engineer looks at it, especially a treatment engineer from this part of the world looks at it, is a little bit more specific than the general concept of drinking water itself, or drinking water treatment, or the concept of water security. So if we wanted to talk about water security, the first and foremost thought in many people's minds, especially under pressures of climate change, is water availability. Fortunately, we live in a relatively wealthy place when it comes to water, but that doesn't mean we don't have issues with water availability. Water issues can also be related to the timing of that availability. And again, oftentimes people can think of those issues with related when thinking about climate change. But for a drinking water treatment engineer who has an available water supply, or at least a reasonable amount of water, quality is just as much of an issue as availability or quantity. And it's quality that drives what we do. When we are trained in our undergraduate programs, I'm also the associate chair for undergraduate studies in our department back in Waterloo. When we're trained to treat whatever comes out of that pipe. And that's what we do. Engineers build things and make things happen for society. That's why we wear these iron rings. When I moved to Canada, one of the first things I did, because I like being an engineer, is I got one of these iron rings because it reminds us of our obligation to society. What we do matters for society. And for us, quality is part of the constraints. You treat whatever you get. We can make water on the space station. It's just a question of how much you're willing to pay for it. So that's why forests are so important, because forests provide natural treatment of water. That's why the highest quality supplies emanate from these areas. You get snowmelt, but you also get natural treatment in that environment through the natural infiltration process. And as water makes its way down through the groundwater and then again resurfaces at either lakes or streams, you get natural treatment and attenuation through those processes. And therefore, it's not a big surprise, and this goes back to over 10 years ago, that it's commonly understood in the water industry that if you have forest cover, healthy forest cover, that you can really significantly reduce the costs of drinking water treatment and cost to society. It's generally understood as a rule of thumb in design that for every 10% in forest cover you have in the source area, your treatment's going to go down as far as chemical costs go by about 20%, up to about a point of 60% forest cover. Now, this is a highly empirical relationship, and the 2 points that are outliers in this particular study were associated with forest cover that wasn't considered healthy. I'm a treatment engineer, and so perhaps some of you can help me better understand what healthy means, especially with respect to the relationship to water. But I can tell you how I see it and how my industry sees it. And I think it's important, so what I'd like to do is to go through a little bit of our perspective and how we get to some of these points. Because sometimes I think that we almost get to a point where it's not the science driving what we're doing, but perhaps habit or inertia or policy, whether it be regulatory or not. And so it's always important to remember why you're doing what you're doing. So let me start with the role of the treatment engineer and the role of our relationship with society. So we own this. So what you have here is the major causes of death during the years 1900 and 2010. And so when we take our job up, when we're providing safe drinking water, our number one priority is people not dying. That is what we are supposed to be doing when we design and operate treatment processes. You can see in this slide that there's been an over 3,000% reduction in deaths attributable to infectious diseases. And that is exclusively because of the role of water and wastewater treatment engineers and scientists and the whole public health sector and the contemporary age of hygiene in the world. 4 of the major causes of death have changed since 1910 because of the advent of chlorination. If you think about death rates for infectious diseases as a whole, you can see here in this figure. Here's the first continuous municipal use of chlorine in water in the United States. There was an influenza pandemic up here. But as we progress through the 20th century, penicillin didn't make a dent compared to chlorination. Neither did the introduction of vaccinations. The major causes of death have changed because of the provision of safe drinking water. And that's why in parts of the world where there isn't safe drinking water, people are still dying because of infectious diseases. So this is our job. This is our mandate, and it's important because it tells you what drives us with respect to the decisions we make and the policies we create. So you can see here, this is, again, the advent of chlorination over that same century, and we're looking at typhoid fever in particular, and you can very clearly see, you can take your pick of these infectious diseases. The rates just drop as chlorine spreads. Chlorine's one of the tools in the toolbox we use, but it's a powerful one and it's an inexpensive one. And to this day, it still remains critical in our arsenal in protecting public health. And what might also shock you is that we don't measure every aspect of water quality every day when we're providing water to your tap. In fact, there are very few, because we know that if we have this concept of well-operated treatment, and we have all sorts of definitions as to what that means, there's actually very few things we need to measure, and that's good. Because if we had to measure all of those aspects of water quality that are of health concern, we'd run out of money. If we had to do it on a daily basis, heck, on a weekly basis, never mind an hourly basis. So we need to be certain and comfortable and conservative in knowing that what we're putting out into the tap is safe, because we're not allowed to put something out that can kill somebody. It has to be safe or we don't put it out. And people don't usually drink from a river. They drink from a tap or from water that comes from the tap if they have safe, distributed, potable water. So it comes down to something pretty simple with respect to what we look at. And this is a critical criterion that took me a long time to really wrap my head around. When we design water treatment plants, especially surface water treatment plants that tend to have lesser quality than groundwater, but not always, the biggest problems for water treatment almost never are issues of health concern. And so you can often tell when somebody's talking about, yes, all of this work I'm doing, All of these risks are relative to drinking water. You can tell if they've actually interacted with people or know something about drinking water, because if the first thing that they say is, look at all these heavy metals, the treatment folks know that they probably haven't talked to any treatment folks, because heavy metals, while they're problematic from an ecosystem perspective, problematic if they're going to bioaccumulate in fish, they're actually relatively easy to remove, and they're not, we only measure them monthly at best, because we know we can get them. So what we measure is turbidity. So it's a measure of solids. Why turbidity? Doesn't even have units of mass. We measure turbidity because we can do it in real time. And we can have very low resolution for turbidity that you can't get with total suspended solids. And we measure color and organic carbon, total organic carbon or dissolved organic carbon. And it's because, as you can see from a textbook that's already got a few years on it, those two drivers are the drivers of the majority of our infrastructure decisions. And there's a caveat to that. That and making sure that we can disinfect, chlorinate, or somehow deal with organisms so that we don't have infectious disease spread. So how do we achieve that? And as much as I would like to talk about this for a longer period of time, this is a slide I'm sure several of you have seen me present in the past. I won't go into it for too long, but I want to impart one idea here. Yes, in general, if we're talking about treating water and its treatment of groundwater, we don't typically need a lot of infrastructure unless there's a unique contaminant, like say arsenic, for example, then you need a specific infrastructure. But in general, for groundwater, all we usually have to do is chlorinate or disinfect in some way. Typically chlorination, it's quite inexpensive and it's really good to, easy to work with. So we're going for those organisms that create infectious disease. But when you put chlorine to water, unfortunately, it doesn't just make its way and react through oxidative reactions with microorganisms. Unfortunately, it reacts with a whole bunch of other things too. And so we typically have had to put a whole lot of infrastructure in place just so that we can efficiently disinfect water. And all of this infrastructure, which is large footprint, consumes a lot of energy, a lot of moving parts, a lot of expertise required to operate it. Most of that is focused on removal of two things: solids and dissolved organics. Metals go along for the ride with the solids. Some nutrients like phosphorus typically go along for the ride with solids. So if we can remove solids well, and we can remove organics well, we can disinfect well, and we can protect public health. But of course, life's not always that easy, because you trade one thing off, and then you deal with one problem, and then you'd create another. So part of the problem that we have to deal with up front is if we have organics in the water, they drive treatment, but they also can cause other problems. And so let's dig a little bit deeper, and let's talk a little bit more about what is treatment. So in a typical drinking water treatment plant that treats water that has solids and organics in it, a typical surface water, and let's assume there's no industrial contaminants or anything like that that requires specific technologies, but typical high-quality water in Canada. The first step, we add chemical coagulants. So these are the chemicals that are going to take all those fine suspended materials, and they're going to affect their surface charge so that we can aggregate them to one another and make them stick together. Why do we need to do this? We need to do this because most particles in water have the same charge, negative. And usually the origin of that charge comes from dissolved organic matter, dissolved organic carbon. So we'd love to remove those particles, but we're also thrifty. We don't want to charge a lot for water. Our customers demand high quality water. For what do you pay? You might buy a bottle of Evian for maybe $3, 500 milliliters. You can get 1,000 liters of water, equally high quality, depending on where you live, for $1.50 out of your tap. People in this country are not like Europeans, where you hear the stories of water is more expensive than beer. And it's because we have so much water, we're not used to paying for it. So we need to take that into consideration when we treat the water. So one of the things we try to do is to take advantage of gravity rather than high energy intensive processes. So you put a chemical coagulant in, you change the charge of the particles such that you can bring them together and aggregate them. Flocculation is general mixing. There's particles all over the place, and we want to create contact opportunities to bring them together. And then there's some sort of clarification process. Sometimes it's flotation, typically it's gravity sedimentation. Once we make the particles sticky, we bring them together, then we just let them sit and settle. Vast majority of particles will be removed that way. A lot of our compounds of interest, like dissolved organic carbon, will be removed that way. Whatever is left over then goes to a filtration process, which is not what most people think it is. Most people think it's size exclusion. But the problem is the particles that we want to remove are about 1 micron in size, 4 microns in size, and the media grains that are in those filters are about 1 millimeter in size. So you can imagine that the pore spaces between those media grains, those particles could just go flying through. The reason they don't is because of what we did in advance of that process. That's why it's called chemically assisted filtration. We modified the surface chemistry such that these particles want to stick to surfaces. It's thermodynamically favorable. That's what happens in the filtration process. And that is why for surface water, filtration is a key process. And it's not just this one box, it's this plus everything that comes before it. Because they all work in harmony. And we need that because of the nature of the water so that we can remove the solids, remove some of the pathogens, and then get to the final disinfection step without any chlorine demand or oxidant demand getting in the way. That's drinking water treatment in a nutshell. There's variations of it. That is why design is driven by these parameters. Because if you have a high quality meltwater, you typically might not see a lot of carbon in it. But of course, water only deteriorates with disturbance. You might just see that carbon during the freshet. But once you get past a certain threshold, there's more infrastructure. And this is just conventional treatment. Once you get past another threshold, if you have a lot of urbanization, for example, you have a lot of urban runoff, and now you've got people fertilizing their lawns and all these other synthetic organics coming into the system, then there's another threshold where somewhere in here, on either side of filtration, you're either implementing advanced oxidation processes like ozonation, or you're using activated carbon that has to be replaced on a semi-regular basis and is quite expensive. This is why when places like Calgary did their upgrades in the last 10 years, they spent $600 million doing it. Large footprint, high energy consumption. And we could get into more processes if water quality deteriorates more. So in Alberta, we're not like Europe with a longer history of industrialization and less awareness because of history of environmental issues. So our high quality supplies have the most to lose because they have the most possible opportunity for deterioration. And let's not forget that there's a whole nother treatment plant that I didn't mention. It's called a residuals management plant. So all of the waste that comes out of these processes, we have a whole nother plant to deal with those. And what you hope they're doing, that doesn't happen everywhere, is implementing those plants, because otherwise where's that waste going to go? It's going to go right back into our blue ribbon fly fishing rivers and gum up the gills of fish, because that's what it's supposed to do. It makes things sticky. So it should be going to landfill, but it depends on whether or not you have a variance or not to actually meet those requirements. And there's more to this process. There's a whole other part which people have heard about. What's this boil water advisory thing? Is that supposed to be part of the treatment process? In this figure on the right, as of January 2015, there were at least 1,838 drinking water advisories. In effect, about 169 of those were drinking water advisories in 126 First Nations communities. The rest of them weren't First Nations. And I sometimes wonder, as a drinking water engineer, do people wonder why are boil water advisories okay? Certainly this isn't what we target. Sometimes wonder why there's no more of an outcry. There is sometimes. But is this what we want to achieve in a wealthy place like Canada? And I guess I would ask the question, what's the alternative? Why do we have boil water advisories? So if you think back to that diagram, we have boil water advisories typically because something is happening and we want to make sure the water gets disinfected so that those infectious diseases don't spread. That's why they're there. But why do we put water out like that? And the reason is because, very simply, we need the flowing water for hygiene. Even if you can't drink it, even if you have to boil it, that is a whole lot better, much, much better, than being in a situation where you don't have flowing water. Because what happens when you don't have flowing water? One of two things. Either you see people bringing in water immediately, and it's a service disruption, and it's an expensive service disruption, but it's not remotely as expensive as the alternative. Because the alternative is that infectious diseases start. So the minute water stops flowing is when the clock starts ticking and the folks in the treatment plants are scrambling. This is the part that's scary, and this is the part that doesn't get reported in the news. And this is happening today in the United States. Puerto Ricans are US citizens, and they have been without water for in excess of a month. 76 reported cases of leptospirosis, which can be easily helped with just a cap full of chlorine. 2 confirmed deaths, more suspected deaths. And it's the cycle, and the longer it goes, more people will die. It's so bad in Puerto Rico right now that Puerto Ricans are taking their children to known hazardous waste sites to drink water from the wells that are monitoring the spread of contamination, because they know that that's not as bad as certain fate, or very much higher probability of that fate, not certain fate, from acute illness, from infectious disease. So these aren't what-if scenarios, these are scenarios that happen. And if you're landlocked and inaccessible, or if you're on an island, those risks grow, and they grow quickly. So that is why boil water advisories are much better than not having flowing water. And so, to give you more on my perspective on this lens, because it will get to the point of forest management, I brought what I have in my office. And I brought it because it's a sign for me for how much my perspective has changed and how much I've learned in my life. And really, I'm in a very different place than I was many years ago, and largely I have opportunities in Alberta to thank for that. So what I have in my office, which I've always had, is Dr. Seuss's The Lorax. Because this is the first thing that, as a child, made me cry, and in a situation where it wasn't about me. And when I talk to environmental engineering students, because we're often looked at as the custodians of the planet, we'll clean up people's messes, it's just a function of how much money will be spent. This is what I think about. It's the first time I was inspired to think about the world around me and the impacts of what society does on that world. And a big part of it for me was this section where, if you know the book, the fish have to leave because, and they're not just fish, they're humming fish who hum, and they have to leave because their gills are all gummed. And they're in search of water that isn't so smeary. I got this book. I was born the year this came out, so I got a book later on. The original version is not the version I'm holding. It's this one, because it says they're in search of water that isn't so smeary. I hear things are just as bad up in Lake Erie. So this was written in 1971. And here's the thing. Even then, people were recognizing that there were problems with water supply, and we're still having them in Lake Erie. This is a satellite image of the Great Lakes, and we're still having problems with nutrients making their way downstream and creating problems. And we thought in 1980 was the year of water, and in those subsequent years, we thought we were getting control and a grip on some of those issues of nutrients. But it's never as simple as you'd like it to be. And once again, not only are algal blooms increasing, not just in the Great Lakes, but everywhere globally, but harmful algal blooms are increasing. Harmful algal blooms, more appropriately described as cyanobacterial blooms. You can have nerve toxins, cyanotoxins, nerve toxins, hepatotoxins, neurotoxins, so nerve toxins. These are serious. And when these happen, and we've heard about this, we can put water systems completely out of service. And that's what happened in 2014 in Ohio. 3 Ohio and Michigan counties, actually. Over 400,000 people were affected due to contamination with cyanobacteria. Multiple blooms this summer. As late as July, there were 3 or 4 in Chautauqua Lake, New York. They're occurring. And the problem with these is, yes, we can treat these as well, but it's hard. It requires expertise, and the part that most people don't get about that is sometimes we get it wrong, because we don't have a lot of ability to respond. We have concepts of recovery in water treatment, but they're not like concepts of recovery in forest management. If a water treatment plant recovers quickly, it recovers in 3 hours. It's really hard to gauge how water quality is changing over 3 hours to get our dosing right in these systems. And even if we can put the water through, sometimes we overdose or we gum up our system, those filters get clogged up and we can't put enough of it out. But we shouldn't be putting it out if it's unsafe. So we're running. We've got a moving target in these situations, and we're running. And the problem with blooms is that blooms, you have to treat them with kid gloves, because you want to knock them out with the chemicals in the coagulation process, and you want to remove them. But you don't want to get any chlorine in that system, and you don't want to beat them up too much in that process, because if you do, they can break open. And even a dead cyanobacteria still can release its toxin. And if you release your toxin, then you're in trouble, because it's pretty much immediate shutdown if it's toxic. Not all cyanobacteria are toxic, but there's an increasing number, and we don't know why. We think it has to do with nutrient balance, not only phosphorus, which has always been blamed, and of course these things don't happen if there's not enough phosphorus in the system, but it's something about nitrogen-phosphorus balance. We don't know. So this is what can put us out of service, and sometimes for a long time. And just to give you a perspective, I live in the region of Waterloo. Region of Waterloo is agricultural municipal. We have a lot of heavy agriculture. So we have all that treatment that you saw up there, plus ozonation. It's an advanced oxidation process. That's our silver bullet against these blooms, because even if some of those toxins get through, then we can still treat them with a super duper oxidation, very strong oxidant ozone. However, recently, this year, one of our grad students learned that, yeah, we can do that as long as there's not too much carbon in the system too. Because if there's carbon, that magic bullet's not such a magic bullet anymore. And in fact, some of that material can carry right through and still be potentially viable, still potentially produce toxin. So now we have to figure that problem out. So by far, the better situation is to not be in this situation. In the region of Waterloo, we had a toxic algal bloom one time. And a little reservoir, not much bigger than maybe two and a half times this room in terms of area. Small. $600,000 in 2 months just to make sure that toxin wasn't going into the community. That's only, at that point in time, maybe half of our water supply for the region, because fortunately we're blessed in that we are the largest users of groundwater in Canada. We have a nice, high-quality supply there. When these things get in the water supply, weirs get clogged, they get fouled, which means they get all mucky, they're difficult to clean. The coagulation, flocculation, settling process doesn't work well. It's tricky. And you have folks running around the clock hoping that it's working, and also hoping that nothing's making its way through. So there's all sorts of support staff and a support lab, and you're running 24/7 to make sure that things are okay. And it's hard when you don't know what to dose because water quality is changing in some cases. So this is what has formed our policies and our attitudes and our thinking in the industry. And so let's put a little bit more resolution on it. So these microbial risks, they're acute. These things can happen quickly. You can get sick quickly. Another key component of what informs us is the chronic risks. So treatment was developed so that we could deal with these acute risks, but somewhere along the way, we started to recognize around the 1960s. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. We started to realize that, hey, there's also chronic risks that occur from some of the chemicals that we're releasing into the environment. They're making their way into our water supplies. Her work was on DDT in specific, but then she went on to look at other issues. She was met with fierce criticism by chemical companies through much of her life after the book was published. But it was that work that led, in the United States, to the formation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Because now we had to deal with not only these acute risks that we need to make sure our systems are working every day, but let's make sure we don't get something like a metal or a synthetic organic that's going to cause chronic risk. But we don't have to check for them as often, because they're usually there or they're not, unlike microbial risk, which comes and goes much more. Usually for a chronic risk, once your supply is contaminated, it's contaminated. Plus, minus. That's why we regulate differently. That and, of course, wanting to use our limited dollars to protect public health as best as possible. So finally, that's the lens through which our industry, the drinking water industry, informs the idea of source water protection. It's through those constraints. We've developed strategies to protecting drinking water supplies, and they have specifically, because of these things we've discussed, focused on not contaminating the water supply. Do not contaminate the water supply with something of health significance, a contaminant of health significance. And that has served us really, really well. It makes good sense. Don't put the risk, why introduce the risk into the system? Prevention, mitigation if necessary, conservation, prevent those contaminants from getting in. And so that has led to a metaphor that we use in the industry quite a bit. And I should go back. Source water protection. We have source water protection policies. Source of what? Source of drinking water. This is very much from the lens, this concept of the drinking water community. And the metaphor that we use for these policies, it's indeed where the idea of source water protection originated, is protecting from contaminants of health concern, sometimes literally by putting a fence around it. Put a fence around it, don't let it in. That fence might be real, or it might be an invisible fence that is driven by regulations or policies, rules. No recreational activity in a watershed. This is a watershed, a drinking watershed. It's protected. And that works great for industrial polluters. It works great for industrial polluters. It works great for mitigating activity, to some extent, human activity in the watershed. And for a long time, for decades, this has been enough. "30, 40 years. And so it's consistent with this book. Don't contaminate, protect. What can we do? Do we need to do more? What do we need to do to protect our drinking water? Are we in good shape? I once heard that a famous UW hydrogeologist made the statement that the biggest threat to groundwater in Ontario is from the Ministry of the Environment. He did have tenure. That's John Cherry. So, Bill, you stole my thunder today at lunch. You just didn't know it. Bill made the same statement, Bill Shoddick. I don't know that I think of it that way. I think I know what John meant when he said it. I don't think, though, that the folks at the Ministry of Environment want to pollute, or did at the time, because this was some time ago. I think it's more about perspective, and it comes to this point in the discussion that I was talking about, which is, what is your perspective? Where do we come from? So this book, Unless. The whole point here is unless, if nothing's going to change if somebody doesn't care. That's what this book says. And it's really interesting because at some point then at the very end, I thought about in coming here, I should reread it. There's another point where it says, yes, you should care, and that's all great, we should care about the environment. But then somehow it said, okay, plant a new truffula tree. Treat it with care. Give it clean water and feed it fresh air. Grow a forest. Protect it from axes that hack. Then maybe the Lorax and his friends will come back. Okay. So where does that leave us now? Things are changing now. I don't know that the policies that we have had relied on all these decades are going to be enough now. I know that I don't think so. I'm curious to know what others think. Things are changing. There's this concept, and this is a great paper that came out by colleagues from the USGS. You know, stationarity is dead, with or water management. What does that mean? That means that this concept of stationarity is that we have relied on, all of our designs assume that water quality is going to vary in a range. And that it's stationary, it's not going to change outside of that range. And as it says on this paper, climate change is undermining those basic assumptions that have historically facilitated the management of water supplies, demands, goals, the production of safe drinking water as well. This paper was written from the perspective of drought and hydrology and flooding, but it also applies to treatment and quality. And we see this growing. This is going back to Lake Erie with projections by NOAA looking at cumulative loads of phosphorus into that system. And they're increasing. They're not staying stationary, they're changing. And they're pushing us to limits that we didn't plan on when we first set out to design our plants 30 years ago or more. So we're seeing floods, Calgary, all the extremes. Pest infestation. Broken and snapped off trees This is in Southbridge, Massachusetts in 2011. A lot of blowdown after in Halifax after Hurricane Juan in Nova Scotia in 2003. And then there's wildfire, probably the most looming and threatening of the disturbances that can happen on the landscape, probably the most potentially, not always, but potentially catastrophic. We didn't plan for this. We're used to nice, stable water supplies. They can fluctuate a lot, but they're still within a given range. All bets can be off in some cases, depending on how we planned and got to this point in time now. But the thing is, we can't change the past. We got to the point we're at. The question is, what are we going to do moving forward? How are we going to adapt? I've had the wonderful experience of working with great colleagues, predominantly here at the University of Alberta, but from other institutions as well, looking at the impacts of wildfire on all aspects of water, ranging from water quality, stream flows, stream ecology, downstream water resources, and drinking water. We thought we would just start with one fire, and we didn't really have any intentions of going to more. But they keep happening. We historically struggled for years to get funding, and everybody said it's not going to happen again. It's a one-off. Fortunately, we were able to get some support, and there's a lot of things that we've been able to learn. And we've been able to take that on to other fires. So I think people here know that 90% of the fires are typically quite small, but the big ones are really big and burn most of the area. And the thing that's troubling with climate change, and we could talk about other disturbances as related to water, but let's talk about fire. It's so relevant here. It's the dominant disturbance here in Alberta. In general, fire size over the decades, which is what's presented here as percentiles, is getting smaller. But the big ones are getting bigger. And we've seen that. We have seen that here just in the last few years. This stops at 2010, but given what's happened recently in this province, pretty sure that number is still going to be pretty high and going up. And what does that do to water? Well, as you would imagine, you can see a lot of erosion on the landscape as a result of fire. And what we've got from the Southern Rockies Watershed Project, which I've had the pleasure of working with Aldous and a fabulous team since 2004, 2005. We looked at unburned or reference watersheds, burned watersheds, and post-fire salvage log watersheds. And not surprisingly, perhaps, given the environment we're in, because not all environments are going to behave the same way and have the same responses to wildfire. But in this environment, with its rich history of sedimentary deposits, you see a lot of material that becomes available after enough energy is put into the system to erode it away. So you have more of this material in disturbed systems, especially when there's energy, such as during a storm flow or a snow melt. We see the sediment. Certainly we see turbidity, which is what drinking water engineers are concerned about. And fortunately, the government allowed us to keep studying this fire, because if we had stopped it after a few years, we might have thought, hey, things are recovering, they're coming back to baseline. But actually, that's not the case. Those were just dry years, and so there wasn't enough energy in those systems to mobilize some of that sediment. So there's no recovery in these systems. These impacts are there, and they can be expected to last. And we can talk about why that is. It's the nature of the rivers. And if there's turbidity in those systems, phosphorus was liberated, it's going to be associated to some extent with that turbidity, and sure enough, we see it, and we haven't seen that recovery. Same thing goes for dissolved organic carbon. The water gets increasingly variable, and it can change quickly, and that is what can keep treatment engineers running. If it's about a threshold, if I know 3 months from now that I'm going to have a certain level of turbidity, no problem. The problem comes in one of two ways. If I get a really quick run-up on that turbidity, then I might miss the dosing. And the other thing is, what if I don't have enough chemical? Or what if there's so much organic carbon driving charge in the system after a wildfire that I can't dose my maximum chemical dose because I might have residual alum that's going to exceed health limits, or aluminum in that system. Those are the concerns we have. And when we have residuals like that in the system, then sure enough, not only do we need more chemical coagulant, but we also form byproducts of those reactions that if they're left at high levels in the system, they're indicators of potential chronic risk from disinfection byproducts that may or may not be carcinogens. So these systems are changing, and you can see it in the images, from an undisturbed system to a disturbed system. They're changing the carbon character of the water, and they're increasing our coagulant dose requirements. And so what they're also driving is the need for infrastructure, not only in the plant, but also in our reservoirs, where you can see a lot of the sediment load, thankfully, in Fort McMurray was handled by the fact that they had 2 reservoirs, not 1. Most plants don't have that. But now that they've got that reservoir in there, they have to be worried about algae. That's why they are spending $1 to $2 million to dredge that reservoir, because if they let that phosphorus sit, they might get what we saw in Waterloo with our 4 reservoirs and a progression to the greenest where we had that algal bloom. And it's getting harder for us on this continent because this is a 2017 study that says that for the first time in the history of the United States, water treatment, the provision of safe water, is becoming cost prohibitive for people. Too much. So there's a lot of movement to do something about it. Fire, flooding. What can we do to protect our water supplies? Yes, we can invest in gray infrastructure and plants, but what more can we do? Well, being around here, I've heard ideas like, we can manage the forests. What does that mean? In some cases, it means cutting trees. Well, that's not good, is it? That's going to potentially lead to problems with our water supply. And I had a really transformative experience while out in Alberta. And it was, Monica, what are you looking at? It's not, there's this field of burnt trees. And I was told, Monica, foresters aren't looking at that. I said, well, what are you looking at? We're looking for our friends. The baby trees. That's what we're looking for. In fact, Monica, in some of these places, this is what the trees need to actually be able to proliferate. And they're trees. They grow back. And so what we've done collaboratively in our group is in learning more about forest management, which you all know more about than I do, that there are things we can do to increase resistance and resilience on the landscape. So maybe we're not going to prevent those fires, but maybe we can mitigate some of those risks. And the drinking water industry is really, really looking to people like you globally to help with that. In our network that Aldous was talking about, we actually, the call, I put it up here, the UNSRC strategic area, new clean technologies need to be developed to treat legacy and/or new and trace contaminants for water, for drinking water. That is where the 4-Water Network for Drinking Water Source Protection Technologies came from. And our goal is to test the hypothesis. It's not to sell the concept, because we don't know what the implications of forest management to increase resistance and resilience, starting off with harvesting, will be. So we need to know if we're entering into a problem where we trade off one problem for another, or maybe this is something that can help. So that's what our network is about. And what's interesting is globally, people are assuming that this is going to be great. And maybe it will be. Maybe it won't be. I don't know. But
Well,
this
the
is what's
biggest
happening in the
thinning
U.S.
project in U.S. Forest Service history is now underway in our state. In fact, workers are cutting and hauling away small trees on the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest near Aber.
It's part of a 20-year project to restore health to forests and prevent devastating wildfires. ABC 15's Christina Estes has been digging deeper. And Christina, you found this project has implications for the valley as well.
Yeah, when we're talking about healthy forests, we're actually also talking about our water supply. Now, we get most of our water here in the valley from snowpack. And in the spring, that snow melts, runs down the mountains. And when it runs into areas like this, well, that's a problem. After a severe wildfire like the Rodeo Chetaskai back in 2002, the runoff sweeps dirt into streams and reservoirs. After the Rodeo Chetaskai fire, SRP saw a lot of ash and sediment in Roosevelt Lake. And when that happens, cities then have to spend more to treat the water.
I'm not sure that the promise of forest management is to prevent fires like was mentioned in the clip. But there's a lot of assumptions going on that this is what we need because we're out of tools to try in the plants at present. And if you look, you can see whether it be the Nature Conservancy, Arizona Forest Fund, etc., groups are looking to mitigate risks from wildfires. And we need help. We need to understand the implications of these techniques, not only for the traditional aspects of water that are looked after in forest management, but more specifically with respect to drinking water, so we're not creating risk in this space. But I understand from talking to people who work in this area that we have hope. You're the ones who would know. Forests need to be resistant and resilient. How do we do that? Structurally diverse forests, or those withstand diversity. Some parts of the world it might be easy because there's so much diversity there, like the East. Other parts, not as much diversity in terms of species. This is here in southern Alberta. A lot of lodgepole pine. But you can still get that structural diversity, I understand, through things like age class structure. And some of that can be achieved with various tools, not just leaving it up to the whim of Mother Nature. Because Mother Nature can be harsh. So this is what we're talking about exploring and doing. There's certainly a lot of interest in our industry to do this. I hope that we do it well, so that we understand the implications of the activities we're getting into. But I think that it's time to stop the inertia and to think about the constraints of the new problems we're facing today, and part of that is moving our policies and practices and hopefully working together in that, to do that. And so what I would say is that it's time to engage in that discussion, and it's wonderful to have the opportunities to do so. So thank you very much for your attention, I appreciate it. Sorry, that was a bit long. Okay.
Trying to put the lights up a bit. Thank you, Monica, for an amazing presentation. I certainly learned a lot. And the floor is open for questions. So there are microphones located exactly where the helpers have. There's one over here, and there's one on the other side. So people can run to you, or you can inch your way out. So put your hand up if you have a question, please, and we'll try and get you a microphone.
I see you.
Oh, way at the back. You have to use the mic, please. Please use the mics.
First of all, thank you for your talk. Being from chemical engineering department and working with water treatment, this was by far the best presentation we ever had about water treatment. That's funny, right? My question goes back to trace contaminants or the contaminants of emerging concerns, like pharmaceuticals, personal care products. And I think our question is there any policy or direction in the policy in Canada going towards that direction to consider those contaminants as serious contaminants or to do anything about it in the wastewater and drinking water?
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of discussion. There certainly is a lot of discussion. I can try to project. There certainly is a lot of discussion, isn't there? Right?
Yeah.
So, are you able to, oh, thank you. I didn't want to yell through the microphone. Do you think there should be?
Well, I know that the discussion goes all the way to the fact that there are all sorts of effects on, recorded effects on fish and snail and other animals. There is no recorded effect on humans yet. And we kind of heard this discussion that so some policymakers are still waiting for seeing those results on humans.
Yes.
Some people are saying if we see the results on humans, it's too late to do anything about it. And kind of this goes back and forth. And we know people work on it, stop working on it, and again work on it again sometimes later. So that's why our question comes from, basically.
Yeah. And so what do you think about it?
Well, we think it should be, considering the fact that consumption of medicines for humans is not going to go down anytime soon, and
Yes.
I'm pretty sure it's not going to happen. All of us need medicine, and considering the fact that the reports showing that the concentration of these contaminants are increasing every year, the effects are getting. We are reporting the effects more and more.
Yes.
But we think something should happen, but we don't know where to start or who ask for, basically.
I don't know either. These are hard problems. And I don't think there's a clear answer. Are people discussing it? Yes, absolutely. Are policies in place slowly emerging? So for example, with the known toxins just for the cyanobacteria, Health Canada has advanced a criterion for one of the toxins, microcystin, anatoxins hopefully coming up. And those are known problems that aren't regulated. There are lots of disinfection byproducts that are more toxic than the ones that are regulated, and they're not regulated because they're not present at high of levels. And so the emerging contaminants are tricky because we don't know about their toxicology. And to me, this is one of the classic examples of a wicked problem that we face in society. Wicked problems have no solution, and no matter what solution you come up with, not everybody's going to be happy with it. So I can tell you that as somebody who has been immunocompromised because of 5 years of cancer treatments, I'm not excited about having those things in any water that I drink. But at the same time, I can also tell you as somebody who works in the drinking water industry that I think money is much better spent on making sure water flows through treatment plants than worrying about some of the chronic problems that may or may not exist because of some of these emerging contaminants and literally the millions of dollars that would need to be spent on them. Furthermore, I can tell you that, and you probably know this because of your studies, but treatment doesn't scale with population. So the more of this expensive treatment you have to have, it's going to be a heck of a lot more per capita in a small community than a large community, right? And if those communities aren't interested in regionalization, then is it reasonable for them to expect equally safe drinking water? Because water does not come in a pristine form anywhere in the environment. And what we do is we have to treat it to make it safe. And so I don't have a good answer for you. People are talking about it, but to be honest, I think the policies are moving towards trying to handle known contaminants as opposed to the emerging ones. The emerging ones are exciting and they get people's attention. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're the biggest risks. And let me give you one example that's very relevant. I agree with you that these emerging contaminants are a problem, but I'll ask you, did you know that there are wastewater treatment plants in Alberta that don't have to have secondary treatment, that they get variances and they only have primary treatment? Because as much as I don't know how much those contaminants may or may not be of health threat, I can tell you that having primary wastewater discharged into a river is going to have all sorts of health threats for the people who are fly fishing right downstream. And so I think we need to, any one issue in a vacuum, and I know I'm being long-winded, but it's important. Any one issue in a vacuum, of course we would love to remove everything from the water. But if I've only got so much money in hand to do it, what do I prioritize? And that's the discussion people don't want to have. right? And that's why we need people like you studying and working so that we can come up with more creative solutions to do this better and more inexpensively. Whether it be on the gray side in plants or on the green side in forest management. They're all technologies.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Have we got another question from the floor? Down at the front, please.
Thank you very much. It was a really interesting presentation. Having personally spent time in Lake Major and Pockwalk watersheds doing the blowdown layout and water sampling, I can certainly see the importance of managed forest and protecting water quality. As recently as, I guess, today, there's been news that the acidification of the lakes in Nova Scotia has improved, coming out from central Canada. But I'm wondering if you have any insight or comments on the effect of forests on mitigating that acidification in those lakes.
I would ask people in this room this question before you ask me. My understanding is that in general, and somebody please speak up if you know better than I do, but my understanding is that in many parts of the country, that people are finding that there is a surprising hydrological resilience and resistance, depending on the system you're talking about in these systems. But here we're really talking about, in the case of acidification, we're talking about resilience, so bouncing back. And I understand that this is pushing some of the conceptual models of how we understand these systems. The folks in Halifax are actually part of our network, and they're very engaged in this discussion, but I can tell you they've also have just a firecracker of a forester working there who is single-handedly looking after their watersheds and attacking them with all of his energy. His name's Barry Geddes. Oh, okay, yeah, he's a rock star, yeah. But so there is an example of a utility that has been invested for a long time, and I suspect, somebody tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know, but I think they're seeing the fruit of his labor. Because yes, there are things you'll see immediately, but some of these things, as I understand, take a bit of time. I don't think it's hurting things, right? The thing with Pockwalk is, in Halifax, the water treatment plant's right in the middle of the forest. Both of them are. Klein, so yeah.
Monica, great talk. Thank you very much.
You really got me at lunch today when you shared that John Cherry quote.
Yeah, sorry about that, but I had
No,
no
it's
idea
great.
how you were going to end your presentation.
I think it's a perfect connection.
I know it's a forestry lecture and water treatment, but I have an agricultural question. So I get the picture roughly how the forest functions, but my question is, in an agricultural situation where we have a shelter belt protecting our streams, do we know sort of how much of that shelter belt we need as a buffer zone along the streams before we get the same function that we have with the forest? So how much tree cover do we need on a farm to protect the water to the extent that these forests are protecting the water?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and I'm again going to say that I think there are folks here that can answer it better than I can, but let me give you my take on it. I think that hydrological processes are complicated, and it's not as simple as having a buffer strip, because you have to know where the water is moving and where the nutrients are and where the disturbance is occurring. In agriculture, it's occurring kind of more uniformly than it might be somewhere else. So we know that tile drains are a problem, for example, in Ontario, right? Do we know how much of a buffer strip we need? I think that for every case study that exists, there will be one that contradicts it, because it has to do with those pathways and how the nutrients are moving, how they're being transformed, what other activities are going on in that space. And so just like I think it's time that we start advancing our philosophies of source water protection, I would say it's probably time to start advancing those other land management philosophies and policies as well. That doesn't mean buffer strips don't have a place, but it just means that we need to be focusing on which nutrients and in what places are there key areas that are particularly significant or at risk. For the longest time we were putting in wetlands to deal with some of these nutrients until we found out that wetlands could also be sources as well as sinks for nutrients. Depends on what time of year. Is there an energy in the system, et cetera? And are we looking at the right things? For the longest time, we looked at water column instead of sediment contributions, so just one type of loading and not another into a system. So I can't tell you about buffer strips, but I can tell you that my understanding is that for every length that is just right, there are examples that show you that that doesn't work. So I know that that's not satisfying, but again, not my area of expertise, and I wouldn't even begin to guess. But I think there's more that we can do, and it comes through having conversations with people that we don't normally talk to. You know, I have a question for you folks. You know, I hear about fire smart. You can fire smart communities. Can you fire smart watersheds? It seems like it would make sense. Maybe not in the same way, but if there's a discussion about constraints and priorities, maybe there's key watersheds. Any more questions from the floor?
I don't think you'll have an answer for this, but
Chances are probably not.
I'll throw it out there.
I'll give it a go.
One of the things I was thinking about, and I've thought about for a couple years now, is that when you go into forests that are managed, especially second growth forests in coastal BC, which is where I worked for a couple years, you notice that they tend to have totally different understory diversity characteristics as opposed to an old growth forest. There's just less stuff under the tree layer. And I guess one of the things I wonder is if we're thinking about our forests as filtration systems, perhaps we ought to think about the idea that the filtration layer is probably actually that understory layer and the stuff that's on there, and that also resists things like erosion, which mobilizes nutrients.
That I can say that I've read, because it's not my area of expertise, but I've certainly read that that is part of the story. I think we should also think about the soils and the microbial activity that occurs in those soils and the transformation that might occur in those spaces should a disturbance occur. So, for example, soils can get highly hydrophobic after a fire. How does that change the situation and the transport relationships? And then, of course, too, there's our geologic history, right? In parts of British Columbia and Alberta, there's a lot of sediment from the periods of glaciation that just ground everything up, and we have all these deposits. That's glacial flour, right? But that's not everywhere. And certainly, you go south in the Rockies to Colorado, they don't have that. They've just got these, you know, they have these big debris flows that come down. It's a completely different geologic system, and therefore the hydrology that connects it's different. And then that's going to be different than the boreal, right? In the boreal, you've got these peats, and the water just sits there, and then it might come down and be connected in moments if the hydrology is right, but it's a completely different hydrology, and you got people studying that here too. So I think that it's, yes, the materials, but it's really the interconnectivity and the movement that we need to think about, the transport pathways and the transformation pathways. But in general, if we really, because this is what we do in engineering and in many disciplines, right? What can you say in general? In general, slowing down those processes, slowing down those erosive processes, slowing down that nutrient delivery is generally a good thing. And that's why we have things like buffer strips, right? Slow that down, bring the peak down, see if you can get some transformation going through the subsurface in many cases, or in the shallow subsurface. But it becomes very case specific, doesn't it?
Dr. Emelko, thank you very much for your presentation. It really, I know the importance of water, and I think everybody in this room knows the importance of water. But as an ecological service, it really positioned it as a very key outcome of forest management. And I'm very interested in the fact that your network, you're focused on forest management-based approaches for drinking water source protection. And I can understand how you might go about doing that when you anticipate that your forest is going to remain green and dynamic over time. But what happens in an event, and you mentioned fire, but let's put mountain pine beetle on top of that, which is perhaps has a slower impact on the forest.
Yes.
How does that, I'd be interested in your thoughts about how you would manage the forest for drinking water production and protection.
First thing I would do is call a forester or a land manager. And I'm not being facetious. I'm being completely serious. When do we get opportunities to communicate like this with one another? I'm not being facetious. But that is the first thing I would do, is I would call somebody who knows a little bit about the situation. So what I'd like to say, because I do have something to say even though I don't have a direct answer for you, is that I think we need to really look at our situation broadly. Because if you look at insults on the landscape, so a slower one, a brewing one like a pine beetle, I suspect that some of the problems that you might see associated with that aren't exclusively because of the pine beetle, but it's the pine beetle and then how much precipitation there is at given points in time, and then is there also a fire on top of this? And so we're really trying to parse out these multiple contributors or cumulative effects. And I guess what I would say is at the end of the day, water quality is only going to deteriorate. It might stay the same. It's not going to get better because of these disturbances, chances are. I've not yet heard of one. And so I think the thing to do is to be adaptive and to look for targets for mitigation. And when I say mitigation, I mean mitigating risk. You can't get rid of risk for water, but you can mitigate it. And the more we mitigate it, the more the probability of problems in our treatment process goes down. At some point, I think there's a point at which you say, you know what, it's time to go, we've done what we can on the landscape and we're going to keep doing it because it's the right thing to do from a sustainability perspective. I suspect I don't have to convince anybody of that here. In other places I do, because everybody just says, build more technology. Technology will save you. Might work, but it might cost a lot to the point of detriment somewhere else. And so I would be looking at what is the balance between gray and green infrastructure? And what can we prioritize to do our best to mitigate? Aldous, do you want to add anything? He's usually the first forester I go to as the co-PI on the network. I know that's not very satisfying, but I wouldn't know the answer, but I try to start to look at priorities. And also, I guess the other part I didn't speak about is it also matters what infrastructure you have in your plant, right? Some will be much better equipped than others, and if the ones there aren't well equipped, then the risk is much higher. So then we have to be more conservative.
Thank you very much for the talk.
Thank you.
I guess it's a two-part question. One, if you were to write your own Lorax, when do you press the panic button for Canadians? The trajectories are pointing to a tipping point. If you had to give your best estimation, 10, 15 years, are we the next Puerto Rico, for example? That's the first question. And second, if economics is not an issue and you're given the green light to basically control Canada's security for water, what are the steps you take in doing such?
Thank you for that question. That's really thought-provoking, so I'm going to try to do it justice. I actually have a little blue Lorax in there, so he'd be blue, first of all. When was the alarm for Canada? Alarm for Canada was before Walkerton happened. Now, Walkerton is an important example, and I raise it because that's an issue that was more operational. It wasn't about the technology. Walkerton shouldn't have happened, but it did. And I'm happy to discuss that separately. It wasn't about the technology. It wasn't about that it was overwhelmed. It was because the chlorine wasn't on. It's simple. If the chlorine had been running, we would have known if we needed to shut the well down. And it drives me crazy that people don't say that out loud. So Walkerton was the alarm, and we did something about it. We started getting regulations instead of guidance. And we hold people responsible now. And they can lose their licenses, and they can go to prison if they do things that are literally putting people's lives at risk. So that's Walkerton. Slave Lake, Fort McMurray, most expensive disaster in Canadian history. As bad as that looked on TV, having the opportunity to go up there before people were fully back in the city was something that I'll never forget in my life. I think that while things can always be better, what happened at the water treatment plant, that for the most part they were able to keep water running, not the whole time. They had to boil water for a bit of time. But the fact that they kept the water flowing is amazing. But when I hear colleagues speaking about these issues, it's not if, it's when. When is the next one going to be? We need to adapt. That's why they're called adaptation strategies. We need to make plans, and some of those plans are as simple as there's a fire in an area that's significant for water treatment. Please let the water treatment folks know. Please don't handcuff them. Let them store enough chemicals and let them deviate from their operational license if they need to, because it's an emergency, as opposed to saying, now this isn't an experience I've had in Alberta, but elsewhere, you don't have enough of the right coagulant, you can't use the wrong coagulant. I'm sorry there's a fire and your water's deteriorated, but your hands are tied. That's happened in Colorado. So I think we need to engage in the discussion, acknowledge that it's real, and I realize that that's difficult in some jurisdictions right now. But the game has changed, and we have to adapt, and we need to start talking to one another. I'll give you further examples. It's time, and it's not to say that people are doing the wrong thing. It's just time to roll up our sleeves and do more. I think that's what the Lorax would say. He'd say, look, you have a health ministry and an environment ministry in every province. And the health people set the health targets, but the environment people are the ones who understand what's happening in the water treatment plants. And sometimes it's not health issues that drive when a boil water advisory needs to be called. It's a secondary health risk, but it might not be because there's a contaminant that's of health risk. So it's time to engage in the discussion and stop saying if it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen next. And it might be a fire here. It could be a flood in Calgary, apparently. It could be hurricanes in the east, but we need to adapt, and we need to know what our constraints and our challenges are, and we need to be honest with ourselves. That's what I think he'd say. And then he'd say, roll up your sleeves and do it. Because we can, because there's a lot of smart people around. That's what I think. That's why I'm excited about this network. I think we can do some good things. Thank you. Thanks.
So just before everybody bolts out of the room, I would like you all to please mark your calendar for our spring FILS lecture and graduate student poster session, which will be held on March 1st, 2018. And I want to let you know that Dr. Joris van Acker, who's in the Department of Forest and Water Management and head of the Laboratory for Wood Technology at Ghent University in Belgium, he'll be making a presentation back on the wood side of forestry entitled Poplar, a fast-growing wood resource, are we maximizing its use? So I hope you're all able to come out in the spring and join us for that and look at all the posters that go up from the grad students. And I wish you all a safe travel home on our snowy day. And those of you who are joining us at the Faculty Club, as you know, it's just a few steps north of here, and that will begin as soon as you arrive. Thank you all.